This summer has gone by so fast, and yet so much has happened in the world. Some things have happened in my life. We're not gonna talk about the world though. We're gonna let all that go and have some fun with knits today because the summer is almost over. This has been my summer of sweaters. Never mind sweater weather. There's no sweater weather in Southern California really, but I have had a sweater summer. Welcome to my Carrie Craft Geek podcast, where I share the story behind my makes, what I am enjoying while I am making pretty things with pretty string, and whatever else might pop into my head. If you are new to my community, welcome. Special thank you for enjoying this month's podcast. I have been knitting for over 20 years. I also crochet and I am learning how to spin, and basically I just love playing around with fiber. So this is where I try to share my love and joy of fiber play. That sounds kinky. So hit subscribe, give this a thumbs up, let me know what you have been working on lately, and let me show you my finished objects from the summer. So I did not plan on having a summer sweater. I had a plan to knit one sweater. And the truth of the matter, the fact is, I have been knitting for over 20 years, but I had never actually completed a garment. I've started tops, but I had never actually finished them. I would just sort of lose interest. So I was determined that this was the year that I was going to climb that hill and I was going to knit a actual finished top. And the one that I finished is the Ethereal sweater by Knit Equals Joy. It was featured in my very first official podcast where I showed my work on the yoke, and it is now complete. So it's up on my mannequin right now. And this sweater, if you don't know, if you didn't watch my first podcast, well, I think you should go back and listen to it because I think all my podcasts are wonderful. But if you haven't seen that podcast, the Ethereal sweater is a top-down yoke sweater. So the yoke sweater started with a 1x1 vertical stripe collar, and then it moves into a two-color, what I would call a honeycomb slip stitch pattern. I chose two colors, just a nice cool blue yarn with a gray yarn, a warm gray yarn called Stone. And then after the yoke is completed, it goes into just a straight stockinette body. The hem is a split hem, which I personally love. I never really loved sweaters with the ribbing on the bottom. I like it to just kind of hang straight and not be having the bottom clinging to me. So I really love this split hem on this sweater, and the split hem was worked in a 1x1 broken rib pattern, which is really cool. Overall, I really enjoyed working this pattern. It was well written, but I did make some changes to it. I knew from the very beginning that I had no use for a long sleeve sweater. Have I mentioned that I live in Southern California? I just don't have a use for it. So I always knew I was going to shorten the sleeves for myself, which was very simple to do. I just, once I was done with the yoke, the length of the sweater was pretty much what I needed to do. And the original pattern with the long sleeve, it was stockinette, and then the cuff was worked in a 1x1 broken rib that matches the split hem at the bottom of the sweater. But since I was going to be doing a short sleeve version, and so the cuff for the sleeve was going to be closer to the collar, I decided to mirror the 1x1 vertical ribbing that's in the collar with the cuff of my short sleeve. So I really love how that turned out. But the big aesthetic change that I made to the sweater is actually in the body. In the pattern, the body of the sweater is worked in single color stockinette. Did I mention the yarn is fingering weight? I decided I didn't want to just knit row after row after row of stockinette in this stone gray color. So I decided that I was going to do stripes in the sweater so that I could carry the blue through, and I just thought it would make it a little bit more interesting for me to knit all of these rounds of stockinette. When I first decided to do the stripes, I thought I would do 1 row stripes using helical stripes, which is a really cool technique of knitting 1 row stripes in the round that are mostly jogless. I say mostly because the beginning and the end, there's a bit of a jog, but it's a really cool way to knit 1 by 1 stripes in the round. However, as I started the helical knitting, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna get bored with this too. And so I changed up my plan and was like, let me do different widths of stripes. And so I decided to do what is called Fibonacci stripes. If you ever read or watched the movie The Da Vinci Code, you may remember the Fibonacci sequence. It's a sequence of numbers where each number is generated by adding the previous number with the number before it. The way it starts is you have the first number 0 and 1. So 0 plus 1 is 1. And then you would add 1 to the previous number. So 0 plus 1 is 1. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 1 is 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. So you're adding the new number to the number just before it to generate the next number in the sequence. And what's really cool about this Fibonacci sequence is that it actually hits on the golden ratio. And so you can make stripes using the Fibonacci sequence to create fades, or you can do it to create, well, what I would call asymmetrical stripes, because there's stripes of different sizes. So each stripe is a different size, and I was kind of picking somewhat randomly which of the Fibonacci numbers I was going to use to knit each stripe, but it all still looks harmonious because it's using this Fibonacci sequence. That's the idea behind it. So I love knitting Fibonacci stripes. It's kind of a fun way to liven up stripes and make them look more interesting than just, you know, stripes that are all knit the same size. So with those kind of aesthetic changes, I really did enjoy working this sweater. And I'm glad that I finished it. I'm glad that for the first time in over 20 years, I finished knitting a top for myself. However, I will say after finishing this project, I would be hard pressed to knit another sweater using fingering weight yarn. Normally, I love knitting with fingering weight yarn. I love knitting tiny yarn on tiny needles. I think it's one of the reasons I generally really enjoy sock knitting. But knitting a whole ass sweater on tiny needles was like, will this ever end? Will this ever end? Will this ever end? It did end. We did make it. I had to jump right into my next project after Ethereal sweater because the entire time I was making this sweater, my kiddo was like, Mommy, will you make me a sweater? Mommy, will you make me a sweater? And I was like, honey, as soon as I'm done with this sweater, I will make you a sweater, I promise. But there were some parameters. One, I was not gonna make her a wool sweater. She's a very active 7-year-old. Nothing good was gonna come of that. Not to mention, have I mentioned I live in Southern California? It was like, we're in the middle of the summer. It was very hot. The idea of making a sweater for a 7-year-old in hot weather seemed, I don't know, it didn't compute. So I decided that I was going to make her a cotton t-shirt, but to her, it's a sweater. So this is the Playdate tee by Needles and Life, also known as Callie Reed. I came across this pattern because I think I actually asked for a recommendation on Threads. And when I saw the picture, I'm like, this is perfect because Playdate tee is a cotton t-shirt that is worked in the round from the top down, and it has raglan sleeves. The raglan increases are created utilizing yarn overs, so it gives like just a nice little lacy detail at the raglan line. So it's not just a plain t-shirt. So it was just really cute t-shirt. The pattern itself was extremely well written. If you've never knitted a top down in the round top before with raglan shaping, I feel like this pattern would be a good investment actually, because it's a very straightforward pattern. There's one little tricky bit at the beginning after you knit the collar. There's some short row shaping so that you get a nice fit along the neck. And if you haven't done short row shaping right after a collar with starting your raglan shaping at the same time, it takes a little bit of careful reading. I will talk more about that in a bit. But this is a really good pattern, I think, for an adventurous beginner, because the pattern itself has lots of information on it on each part of the sweater and tips and tricks throughout. Personally, for me, being a more experienced knitter, the pattern might have been a little too wordy at times. But I would rather a pattern err on being too wordy than not giving enough information. And this is just full of great information if you haven't knitted a top down in the round top before. And it's a really good basic pattern. It calls for DK weight yarn. The yarn that I used was Knit Picks Shine, which is a cotton modal blend. And I bought this yarn years ago, like over 20 years ago, to knit a top that I never finished. So I still had plenty of yarn left, and I was pretty confident I had enough yarn left to make this t-shirt. My daughter really liked the color, and I knew that if worst case scenario, if I lost it yarn chicken at some point in the body of the sweater, I could unravel my unfinished, let's just say abandoned project that I had originally bought this yarn for and have plenty to continue. So this project came together so I could bust some stash and make a special project for my kiddo, who did end up wearing this on her first day of school, which, I don't know. I was a very proud knitting mama, sending my kid off to wear a hand knit t-shirt. I was very proud. But here's the thing that I love most about this project and why it will always be special to me. As I started this, my 7-year-old started going, "Mom, can you teach me how to knit? Mommy, I want to learn how to knit." So I was like, okay. And I just got some yarn. I got some straight needles that I happen to have that weren't metal, so they'd be a little grippier for her, and started teaching her how to knit. And she really took to it. There was one day where she was sitting practicing her knitting, and I was sitting next to her knitting. This actually I had started her sweater, and she just goes, "This is so relaxing." And I was like, yes, I might be raising a knitter. You know, you always hope that you get to pass certain things on to your kids, and I always have hoped that I would get to pass on knitting. But I never wanted to force it on her. I wanted it to be something that she wanted to try. So she was learning how to knit. She was doing really well. And then she started asking if she could knit her sweater. And I was like, well, kiddo, there's some tricky bits right at the top of the sweater. But when we get to the body, how about you help me knit the sweater? So after I got to the split in the arms, and I was into just straight stockinette knitting in the body, I just turned to my kiddo and I was like, "Hey, you want to help knit your sweater?" And she was so excited. I handed her the needles, sat by her, watched her, and she started knitting and doing her stitches, and she was doing great. And amazingly, her tension was very similar to mine. And she started knitting, and then she just says, almost in amazement, she goes, "I'm knitting my sweater." And it was just like, oh, I am so, so happy. So yeah, once we were into the body of the sweater, we really worked on it together. You know, she would knit around and then kind of, you know, be ready to do something else. So she handed it back to me, and I would knit some more rounds. And then when she was ready, she'd be like, can I knit? And I'd be like, here you go. And she would knit some of it. So we really knitted this project together. And so this Playdate tee will always have just a very special place in my heart. So yeah, overall, I really enjoyed this pattern. I will admit, it's almost embarrassing to admit to, but you know, this is real talk on the podcast, and I am human. Even though I'm a very experienced knitter, I am human. And the top of this yoke, as I mentioned earlier, you knit the collar, and then you do this short row shaping in the back, and you start your raglan shaping at the same time. And the reason for that is human beings, we are three-dimensional creatures, and our fronts and our backs aren't exactly even. So a lot of times we need extra fabric in the back to kind of push the neckline down so that so your shirt lays nice and flat and isn't kind of falling back and choking you. That's very important. You don't, I will not wear, I cannot abide turtlenecks because I can't stand the things around my neck. I feel like, it's horrible. It's so uncomfortable. I hate it. But I digress. I made a very silly mistake that as an experienced knitter, I should just know better, which is don't start something like this late at night after you drink wine. I don't know. I was just reading the pattern and it was not computing in my brain. And I was doing it and I do a couple short rows. I'm like, this doesn't look right. This does not look right. What is going on? I ripped back the short rows like 2 or 3 times before it clicked into my head how it was supposed to be working. It was just, it was kind of throwing me, honestly, doing the short row shaping and starting the raglan increases at the same time. Just for some reason threw my head into a loop late at night after drinking wine. I have a feeling that it was being up late and drinking wine was the real problem. Lesson probably not learned, but hopefully learned. One thing though I did do, I will just mention really quickly on this pattern, is that the short row shaping, let me turn this around. You're not gonna be able to see it because I do really tiny short rows, but the short row shaping is right in here. The pattern calls for using German double stitch short rows, GSR, and those are great and I love that technique, but the yarn that I was using is a cotton yarn, and cotton is not forgiving when it comes to discrepancies in your tension, and I, for some reason, was just very concerned about my GSR short rows not being tidy enough. And normally my GSR short rows are very tidy, but I decided instead of doing GSR, I decided that I would do shadow stitch short rows, and I think it worked wonderfully. I'm really glad I made that choice for the sweater. They're just nearly invisible. You have to really would come in and have to look at the back of the sweater to find where they are. I have a video on how to do shadow stitch short rows if you are interested in that, so I will link to that down in the show notes. I didn't have an August podcast episode, and that's because end of July, beginning of August, we were traveling to the East Coast to visit family. Both my husband and mine's extended family live on the East Coast, and the Playdate tee was my travel project. And I have a random recommendation for you that really doesn't have to do with knitting, but I loved this when I was traveling, and you might want to, if you travel during the holidays, you might want to consider this recommendation. First place that we were staying at, we were going to a timeshare in Myrtle Beach to be with my family, and you know, it's a timeshare. They had towels available. However, hotel towels, timeshare towels are like postage stamps. They're so tiny. But when you're traveling across the continent, you don't want to pack a bathrobe either. But I recently got this towel that has elastic along the top and Velcro that was big enough for me to wrap around myself. So it was so great to have this like as a travel robe. Actually, it's not even travel. I am actually enjoying this more than wearing a bathrobe, especially in the summer where it's so hot. Sometimes wearing a bathrobe after you get out of a hot shower is just like, I don't know, it feels like a lot. But this Velcro bath towel that I have is like perfect. And I'm finding that I'm using it more and more in place of an actual bathrobe. I love it. So that's sort of a random recommendation I have for you this month. So those are my finished objects from my summer sweaters. As I mentioned earlier, links to the patterns that I talked about today, materials that I used, and my various recommendations will be linked down in the show notes. There will also be some clearly marked affiliate links, so if you'd like to do some shopping and you use one of my affiliate links that does help me earn commissions, which helps support my channel, or if you just like to leave me a tip through SuperThanks or buy me a coffee, it would be so greatly appreciated. These commissions, these tips really do help me stay active on YouTube. I hope that you enjoyed this month's podcast. If so, please make sure that you give it a thumbs up and share it with your other fiber-loving friends. Liking, sharing, commenting are all great ways that help support the channel and lets YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out. Of course, the best, freest way to help support my channel is to hit subscribe, and that way you don't miss out whenever I upload a new podcast or other video tutorial or review or make with me or the various other video formats that I do here on YouTube. Thank you again for joining me. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you might be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye.